Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In our last episode, Queen Elizabeth lost her mother, and it was a day she had dreaded all her life. And then Hitler started to cause trouble, and Britain started to prepare for the worst because they had an alliance with France, and France was aligned to help Czechoslovakia if they went to war. It was a scary time, so let's see what happens next. September 27th, the King and Queen had a long-standing engagement to launch the world's largest passenger liner, her namesake, the Queen Elizabeth. It was sister ship to the Queen Mary. The King at the last minute had to bow out, but Elizabeth, she went on her own. She would have to make a speech at the launch ceremony, and she left by train from London on the evening of September 26th. All the stations were filled with children being sent out of the capital. The ship was at the John Brown shipyard. It was over 1,000 feet long and ready to run out to sea at the Queen's command. The Queen's speech was broadcast live by the BBC and heard by millions of people across the country. She told them that the King deeply regretted having to cancel his journey to Clydeside, and she had a message from him. The King's message was that he bids the people of this country to be of good cheer in spite of the dark clouds hanging over them, and indeed the whole world. The Queen spoke confidently and clearly, describing the ships that plied through the Atlantic like shuttles in the mighty loom, weaving a fabric of friendship and understanding between the people of Britain and the people of the United States. The last props holding the ship were removed, and very slowly the ship moved, and then there was crowds cheering, "She's off!" The Queen quickly stepped forward to say, "I name this ship Queen Elizabeth and wish success to her and all who sail in her." Then she released a bottle of champagne to break against the bow. The King wrote to say to Elphinstone that he was so proud of Elizabeth taking on that ordeal of broadcasting the speech at a moment's notice when I could not do it myself. September 27th, Neville Chamberlain made a speech that many felt was depressing and seemed to express more sympathy for Hitler than for Czechoslovakia. Churchill was angry about it, and millions of people, though, agreed with Chamberlain. The King himself was moved and sent him a message of sympathy and praise. September 28th seemed to be a final day of peace. The King held a privy council to declare a state of emergency and to agree the mobilization of the fleet. Hitler extended an invitation to an immediate four-power conference with Mussolini and the French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier in Munich. The House was ecstatic. They got together. The dictators offered scant improvement on the terms for dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, but Hitler gave Chamberlain a solemn undertaking that these were his last territorial demands. The Prime Minister chose to accept his assurance. He persuaded Hitler to sign a piece of paper stating that their agreement was symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war again. When Chamberlain returned home outside of London, he waved the paper to the wild applause and read its words aloud. He declared it brought peace and honor and peace for our time. The King sent Neville and his wife an invitation to come straight to Buckingham Palace. They took them out on the balcony overlooking the Mall, and they were given an emotional ovation. Crowds sang "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow" deep into the night. Queen Mary wrote to congratulate the King. "What an excellent photo of you two with the Chamberlains and the papers. The paper the Prime Minister and Hitler signed is most interesting. Let us hope that at last our two countries will come together." Chamberlain's Munich Agreement was welcomed wholeheartedly not only in Britain, but by the vast majority of the English-speaking peoples. Chamberlain got telegrams of congratulations and relief from the Prime Ministers of Canada, South Africa, and Australia. Everyone was so happy to avoid a world war. Even the royal family was enthusiastic, and they publicly embraced Chamberlain and his policies on the balcony scene. And doing that, though, was unconstitutional, and the Queen later acknowledged the mistake. The monarch had to be above party politics, and the Munich Agreement, despite its popularity, was controversial and was still subject to a debate and a vote in the House of Commons. Labour and the Liberals voted against it. The Archbishop of Canterbury wrote to the Queen, "I am so thankful that the King was spared the ordeal which his good father had to face in 1914. Critics, though, included Winston Churchill. He understood the rapture that had greeted Chamberlain on his return from Munich. He was sure that Britain would have to face demands of surrendering territory or liberty. The Germans honored none of the promises made at Munich. Within weeks, Hitler went back on his agreement and started to threaten the Lithuanian city of Memel and the free city of Danzig. In 1938, the Duke of Windsor was still being dealt with. Walter Monckton, who had been attempting to mediate between him and his family over the desire to return to England with his wife in November. Monckton and the Prime Minister got together with the King and Queen at Balmoral. The Prime Minister wasn't opposed to the Duke returning, and he felt he could be given a public role similar to that of the King's younger brothers. The King wasn't against that, but the Queen felt that it was undesirable to give the Duke any effective sphere of work. She was on guard, knowing how charming he could be to persuade people of things. The King wrote to his brother that he should postpone his return until 1939. Queen Mary and the Queen remained opposed to the Windsor's return. The Duke had Monckton ask if he and his wife could see Queen Mary on February 1939. On the King's advice, Queen Mary decided not to meet with Monckton, but she sent him a message saying that she couldn't receive them. Monckton was put in the middle, and it was difficult. He asked the King if you could give the Duke some hope that he and the Duchess would eventually be received. He said it was hard to keep the Duke quiet, and that I should hate to see any open controversy about it. The Duke was still angry when he got a kind letter from Queen Mary. He sounded angry in response to her letter. He said that her letter was extremely illuminating, although I greatly regret that it should have taken so sacred an occasion to disclose so much that is unpleasant, and to destroy the last vestige of feeling I had left for you all as a family. He turned against his sister-in-law that he once loved, the new queen, and he ended his letter, "You, by your final refusal to receive Walter Monckton last month," and this part he wrote in all caps, "Bertie, by his ignominious capitulation to the wiles of his ambitious wife, had made further normal correspondence between us impossible." So this letter upset Queen Mary, and she sent a note to her daughter-in-law asking her to come and see her. The Queen did so, and there's no record of what they talked about, but it is assumed that Queen Elizabeth tried to comfort her mother-in-law. In mid-February 1939, the King and Queen traveled to Tyneside, where the King launched King George V, the first British battleship built in 14 years. They inspected the Vickers Armstrong Armament Works at Elswick, where bombs, guns, tanks, etc. were being manufactured. They also visited various hospitals, health clinics, and training centers. March 15, 1939, Hitler kept marching. The German troops went into Prague, and Hitler announced that Czechoslovakia no longer existed. 3 days later, Chamberlain made a broadcast speech, and the King and Queen listened to it together. Chamberlain had to admit that Hitler had lied to him. He warned the German dictator that sacrifices for peace were over and that Britain would never surrender the liberty that we have enjoyed for hundreds of years. With Germany threatening Poland, Chamberlain and France stood solidly against dictators and their aggression. April of 1939, Chamberlain announced that for the first time ever in the time of peace, the British government introduced the compulsory military service, even though it was opposed by Labour and Liberal parties. The Queen wanted to give the Prime Minister's policies the benefit of the doubt. She didn't like the idea of creating a large army to defend other people's frontiers. She resented Britain being blamed for Czechoslovakia. She feared that in the end, Britain would be left holding the baby, and she was right about that. Hardin believed the Queen's influence counted for a great deal with the King, and that this was usually for the good. In the early days, the King would go speak to the Queen to make decisions, and Hardin observed that her views were further to the right than those of her husband. The Queen knew more about affairs of state than Queen Mary or Queen Alexandra. It's hard to gauge her influence. She was discreet and never talked or wrote, even in letters to her family, about this aspect of her partnership with the King. In the beginning, Hardin found the new King inarticulate and indecisive. Hardin's own guidance, along with the Queen's constant support of her husband, gradually increased the King's self-confidence. After George VI became king, he said that after he got in the position, he was able to make up his own mind for the first time in his life. This meant that his relationship with the Queen began to change. The couple became more interdependent, and she began to rely on him. Her sister Rose said, in fundamental things she lent on him. I have always felt how much the Queen depended on the King. May 1939, the King and Queen made final preparations for a 6-week visit to Canada and the United States. The government debated on whether to cancel the trip, with all the international crises that were going on. And there were rumors that Germany might intercept their ship on the ocean and take them captive. The Queen still wanted to go to the USA no matter how dangerous it was, because not going would give satisfaction to the enemies. So she's a brave lady. So Queen Elizabeth wrote a letter to Queen Mary saying she was just beginning to read Hitler's book Mein Kampf, and she asked if she had read it. At this time, Queen Elizabeth was at the Canadian Pacific liner Empress of Australia. This was May 8, 1939. The King and Queen were at the start of their journey to Canada and the United States, and her reading materials showed where her concerns lay. The King was reluctant to leave Britain as it became clear that Hitler wasn't going to stop. The government advised that war wasn't yet imminent and that the international crisis rendered the tour more rather than less advisable, and it would help boost Anglo-American friendship. The tour of Canada was set to take place as early as 1937, and President Roosevelt encouraged the idea of combining the tour of Canada with a trip to the United States. The president invited the princesses too, but the king thought they were too young. Roosevelt felt sure that the war between Germany and Britain was inevitable. He hoped that the presence of the king and queen on American soil would strengthen the friendship between the two English-speaking nations and sway Congress toward Britain. The journey started to outweigh the Canadian journey because of the personal relationship the king was to form with President Roosevelt. The trip to Canada, though, was significant. It was the first visit by a British sovereign to an overseas dominion. But King George VI was the first sovereign to be crowned King of Canada since the Statute of Westminster had established the status of Canada and other dominions as autonomous dominions under the Crown. From Britain's point of view, the visit was to get support of the Prime Minister Mackenzie King, because he was determined to keep Canada out of any European hostilities. The trip also gave the King and Queen their first opportunity to gauge in person the feelings of the people of the wider empire towards them. King Edward VIII had gained popularity there through his visits as the Prince of Wales, and he had also purchased a ranch in Alberta. Their tour in Canada was a success, and for Queen Elizabeth, this tour was the beginning of a long and affectionate relationship with Canada. She would visit it more than any other country, returning 13 times. They were supposed to travel on the HMS Repulse, but the king thought the Navy should have a warship, so they went on the Empress of Australia. The two princesses, aged 13 and 8, came to see them off, together with Queen Mary and other members of the royal family. The Queen wrote to Elizabeth the next day, and she said, "I hated saying goodbye to you and Margaret. I shall miss you horribly, but be good and kind." And she ended the letter saying that Papa was writing to Margaret. They had to travel across some rough seas, and at the same time the Duke of Windsor seemed to be causing trouble. He had accepted an invitation to broadcast an appeal for peace to the American people direct from the First World War battlefield of Verdun. The timing wasn't entirely his choosing, but it was tactless to make it the broadcast while the king was on his way across the Atlantic. The Queen felt like he was trying to steal her husband's thunder. And then she said, "I see on the news bulletin today that David is going to broadcast to America this evening." She wrote to Queen Mary on May 8th. "I don't wonder whether this is true, and if it is, how troublesome of him to choose such a moment." Alec Hardinge wrote to the king that it was ludicrous of the Duke to think that such a speech could do any good. 3 days later, they had trouble with the weather. The ship was surrounded by thick fog and surrounded by icebergs. The boat had to stop for days, and the Queen wrote home to her daughter, "Here we are, creeping along at about 1 mile per hour, and occasionally stopping altogether for the 3rd day running. You can imagine how horrid it is. One cannot see more than a few yards, and the sea is full of icebergs, as big as globs, and things called growlers, which are icebergs, mostly underwater, with only a very small amount of ice showing on the surface. We shall be late arriving in Canada, and it's going to be very difficult to fit everything in and avoid disappointing people. It is very cold, rather like the coldest, dampest day at Sandringham. Double it, and add some icebergs, and then you can imagine a little of what it's like." So I'm going to end the story here. Hitler lied to Chamberlain and had no intention of stopping at Czechoslovakia, as he had signed on a peace treaty. England knew that they would have to fight for their land and their freedom. Children were sent away to the country for their safety, and preparations of war were made. The Duke of Windsor got very angry in his letter to his mother, Queen Mary, feeling like he had made a contribution to his father's tomb but wasn't given notice on the date it was dedicated. And he felt that his sister-in-law was ambitious, and he told Queen Mary that he didn't feel they could communicate with each other anymore. It was because none of the family wanted to meet him. They were afraid of what he would do if he was allowed back in the country. The Queen got to launch a ship in her own name, which must have been cool. And later in the video, we see the King and Queen make a trip to Canada and the U.S. to try to keep relations close and to get help if war did break out. The travel so far hasn't been very good. They had icebergs all around that must have been very scary. But through it all, we see that the close bond of the King and Queen and how they relied on each other no matter what was going on. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would help out my channel. And I wish everyone a good day. Tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.